We're going to talk about Jesse Jackson today. He passed away today, obviously, as you probably saw. And we're going to talk about his life, his legacy, and a little bit about politics of today and what things he did in the 80s and 90s might tell us about the future. So, Danielle, thanks for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So I want to start with sort of the politics part, for lack of a better way to say that. Is you wrote this essay in a Boston Review that came out earlier this month, and you argued that Democrats of today, who are trying to think about where they should go and what they should do, should take some lessons from the '84 and '88 campaigns of Reverend Jackson. Talk about what you mean in that context.
Yeah, so I wrote that essay in response to a piece that by Jacob Grumbach and Adam Bonica that basically argued that the Democrats should abandon what is an increasingly failing policy of moderation, which I happen to agree with. And I kind of came at it through this historical lens by thinking about Jesse Jackson's critiques of the Democrats' initial turn to the center in the 1980s during the Reagan era. And I show how Jesse Jackson understood very early on that the people who would be most harmed by moderation, by compromising with conservatism, by compromising with the Reagan administration, the people that would be most harmed by that would be poor minority people, people who were already kind of victims of um, Reagan's cuts to social programs and his kind of general politics of moderation. And so I suggest that he kind of offered an alternative vision to this centrist sort of politics that was being proposed by moderate Democrats in the Democratic Leadership Council in the mid 1980s. And it was based really on a social democratic populist agenda that sought to unite what he called a rainbow coalition, which was this. He also used the illusion of a quilt. He liked using metaphors quite a bit as the country preacher, but it would unite these disparate groups, obviously racial minorities who he had been organizing for most of his career, but also dispossessed farmers, displaced workers, gay and lesbian populations who were being harmed by Reagan's, ignoring of the AIDS crisis. He also included immigrants and the disabled and environmentalists and young people in this coalition that he called the Rainbow Coalition, that was united by a shared grievance and a shared experience of harm by what he called economic violence. And he kind of described economic violence as these policies and practices of austerity that really kind of were creating and deepening the wealth gap in the United States in the 1980s. And so he believed that this coalition could be mobilized. And many of them, if we think about African Americans in particular, were kind of demobilized in the Reagan era. Were kind of very turned off by the Jimmy Carter administration and his kind of failure to keep the promises that he had made about full employment, and his kind of walking away from kind of a more robust urban economic development program. So they were kind of demobilized by the Carter era, and were kind of falling out of political participation, particularly at the national level. And so Jackson believed that these people who had been dejected and demobilized and kind of didn't see themselves as part of the political populace anymore could be mobilized and could kind of create a coalition that would be powerful enough to defeat Reaganism.
Let me
Uh,
stop you to sort of
sure.
ask two. One, sort of to say this in the most reductive way possible, because I'm a journalist. So in some ways, Jackson was an early critic of a lot of the sort of what we call like neoliberal economic policies.
Mhm.
And today, in some ways, the Democratic Party is sort of caught up to him, and that you see Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or AOC, even Biden at times. You're seeing a more Democratic Party that's kind of moved away, at least pre 2024, from
Mhm.
2018 to 2024. You saw a move toward what Jackson was talking about, right? He's critiquing
Yeah.
neoliberalism. We're seeing is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I think,
Yeah,
of yeah, of course he wouldn't call it neoliberalism. I think he would call it, kind of a a milquetoast sort of moderation that
right.
was
Yeah.
abandoning sort of the new politics, approach of the 1970s, meaning, a sort of political coalition building that centered peop people that had previously been marginalized,
Right.
prior to the Voting Rights Act. But yeah, absolutely, he was kind of criticizing, kind of the rising power of corporations in the Democratic Party, the rising professionalization, and as I said before, he was very critical of the tendency to, um, moderate and weaken kind of core Democratic Party policies and principles to appeal to this mythic mainstream centrist voter who was imagined by these DLC, these Democratic Leadership Council, um, members as white middle class suburban Sun Belts.
And to read your essay, I assume we're in the same place again. Your essay argues the Democrats can win by mobilizing the marginalized and having a real agenda for human or people. And we're again in this point where I don't know who the DLC of today is. We have a lot of consultants and so on. So I think the
Yeah,
question they would come to you with is like, the median voter is a white man who's over 50 and who didn't have a college degree, who thinks Democrats are too woke and who may not like Trump. So how do you
yeah.
respond to that? Because we're still having the same argument today. Like, what made because in the 80s, Reverend Jackson could not win in part because he faced the sort of white centrist, we're too left, the special interests have taken over the party. We're in the same arguments today. So how do you respond to that today? Because we're having the same version of the same arguments today.
Yeah, well, I would definitely cite the work of, Adam Grumbach and
Adam Bonica.
sorry, Anna Bonica, thank you.
Yeah, yes.
Jacob Grumbach out of Adam
Yes.
Bonica,
Yeah.
um, who have kind of shown using kind of social scientific, they're political scientists, so they have the data to suggest that that tact is not working
Right.
anymore. They argue that it worked in the 1990s, that the tact of triangulation worked, um, Bill Clinton being the most famous example, but they also show that it worked on kind of local and state level, um, races as well. But they have shown that that isn't working anymore. So there's political scientific data to suggest that that is a losing game. But I think as a historian, I would argue that that has never worked for people, at the margins. That
It was always
modern
bad for black people, even if it helped Bill Clinton win the election, maybe, or we can debate
Yeah,
that. But it's, yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So Bill Clinton, the first black president, I guess, very popular among African American voters, but we witnessed the expansion of the carceral state under Clinton, the evisceration of welfare, um, kind of a distancing from the legacy of civil rights within the Democratic Party, or kind of reformulation of it. And so my argument would be that it's never worked and that it has come at the expense of Black, poor, and other marginalized people. Um, I've always also been, like many other people, very attuned to the Zoran Mamdani campaign and kind of seeing a lot of um, echoes of the Jackson campaign in that campaign, particularly in how he was communicating with people, and the way that he sort of mobilized a very clear moral vision, that people could kind of grab onto, and become excited about. Um, and so I think that, New York is kind of an exceptional space, but I do think that that campaign does give credence to the sort of movement-based, morally morally a campaign that's kind of driven by a moral vision of what is right and what is wrong and who is taking from who, and is very clear about who our enemies are. I do think that he has shown that there can be a model for that that can be obviously shaped to other spaces' particular, you know, conditions, but has shown that that Jackson-esque model can work, in this post-2024 era.
Let me move away from electoral politics a little bit and talk about. I guess I've come to learn. You're a historian, so that's why I want to ask you this. Is like that. We used to. I used to think of the civil rights movement as like 19 Brown v. Board is the start in
Mhm.
1954, and it ends maybe when King dies or something like that, and then Black Power takes over, and that's turns off white people and so on. That's a very
Yes.
simplistic story you learn. Even in college, I'd say I learned from other lens. And I think there's been more historical writing that I've read, and I think more people read about the fact there's been a long civil rights movement that sort of started at the beginning of the 20th century, or really right after
Mhm.
Reconstruction. You could probably say that lasts until now, or in Black Lives Matter is the extension of this. But talk. I want to talk about Jesse Jackson's kind of part of that, like in post in my childhood in the 80s and the 90s, Jesse Jackson is probably the most prominent Black figure for like 2 decades in a certain way. So
Mhm.
talk about his role. Talk about the civil rights movement of, say, 1975 to 2000 and what Jesse Jackson's doing.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you brought up the long movement paradigm and how it kind of historians kind of rooted it in the 1920s and 1930s, where there's a very clear economic critique that is paired with the racial critique or the critique of racial discrimination. And so the activists of the 1920s and 1930s were criticizing racial capitalism, the ways in which race and class kind of intertwine, to kind of create a particular form of oppression that creates surplus. Anyway, I say that because that is what Jesse Jackson kind of brings back or really kind of foregrounds in the 1970s. Of course, he is mentored by Martin Luther King. He kind of elbows his way onto the staff of the SCLC in 1965 in Selma, which kind of has a complicated relationship with the other Southern Christian Leadership Conference members. But he's mentored by King at this time that King is really starting to foreground economic critique as well when he's starting to talk about, defeating the three evils, um, and
Racism,
really
militarism, and
and capitalism.
capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so Jesse Jackson he begins as someone who is fighting for Black economic rights and Black economic empowerment. Um, his role in the SCLC was to run Operation Breadbasket in Chicago, which would organize these consumer boycotts against companies that refuse to hire Black people or invest in Black communities. And he's quite successful in kind of winning, thousands of jobs for Black
Mm.
people in Chicago. He leaves the SCLC for reasons that I won't go into, creates his own Operation Push or Operation People United to Save Humanity, and they're still engaged in those boycott practices as well. And so his vision of the kind of the next stage of civil rights is what he would call, or he and others would call, the dollar rights or green power,
Mm.
which was kind of pairing Black economic empowerment with with a political power empowerment as well. And so he's, threatening to boycott major corporations like Anheuser-Busch and a lot of liquor companies, Miller, and he's demanding that not only that they hire Black people at all levels, but that they invest in Black communities, they put their money in Black banks, that they hire Black subcontractors. And
This
so
in the 70s, 80s. This is in the
this is in the
90s.
1970s and
Okay.
80s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
He continues this into the
Yeah.
1990s as well.
Yeah.
Really into the 2010s.
Sure. Yes.
There are these boycotts that come up, but he's able to kind of. Oh, he's also calling for Black people in the boardroom. So at all levels, he's trying to kind of promote this agenda of Black economic empowerment. And that's kind of how he understands the next wave of the civil rights movement, that we've gone from political rights to now we need economic rights. But he kind of, sorry, comes to understand the limitations of that. And that's part of the reason why he begins to organize a political campaign, an independent political campaign.
So in the 80s, what is he doing when he's not running for president, for lack of a way to say that, in the 80s?
Sorry.
Take your time.
He's he's still continuing to work with Operation Push, and then Operation Push becomes the National Rainbow Coalition. So he's still engaged in these kind of economic boycotts, trying to get Black people on boards. He's also kind of the Jesse Jackson that I grew up with. I'm a 90s kid. He would kind of come in when there was this moment of racial crisis,
That's
or
what I
there
remember
was a
most. Yes.
an instance of police brutality. I remember him coming in with the Jana 6 um, case in I think 2005 to 2006. And so he also starts doing that, where he, along with, Al Sharpton, kind of they swoop in and bring attention and money to these
Right.
local organizing and to local issues. So he's also doing that in addition to running for president. He's also engaged in foreign policy as well. He is on the forefront of kind of negotiating against apartheid in South Africa. He kind of has his hand in a lot of different places. I
He
think he
never actually did he
decides.
actually run a church ever, by the way? Right? He's not really, right?
Not
I'm not
really,
saying it's a
no.
bad thing, but that's
His church was Operation
yeah.
Breadbasket, and there was Operation Push, and it was the Rainbow Coalition.
The one thing in your book you talk about is like and there's a Lily Geismer book that sort of hits some
Mhm.
of the same territory. Is like in as he loses these campaigns and the neoliberalism of the party kind of takes over, and he does some of the and he joins in some of the corporate partnerships, private. He sort of moves to the right a little
Mhm.
bit as the party does, right?
Yeah, I would
To say it
argue
very
that it's
reductively,
kind
yeah.
of always there for
Okay.
Jesse Jackson. I
Yes.
mean, remember, he's saying that the next stage of the civil rights movement and Black empowerment is the dollars,
Okay.
economic
Right.
empowerment. So
Right.
he's already saying that the key to Black advancement is going to the corporations directly,
Okay.
not going to the state anymore,
Yeah.
because it's a hostile state unless he runs for president to kind of
Right.
change that.
Essentially.
But he is, and this is my book, is about a long Black tradition of what we could call privatism, and working to improve the conditions of Black people's lives and Black communities through the private sector. So not only through kind of the private home and Black private organizations, but also by partnering with corporations to start Black schools and to pay for civil rights organizing and to pay for legal defense. And so he's really just continuing this tradition of corporate partnerships and what we would kind of call public-private
Right.
partnerships, um, that
In
is
this
very
era, we're talking about the
established.
80s, 90s, the idea that the government's gonna spend more money to is off the table from the Clinton has literally said
Yeah,
the era of big government is over, so you sort of know that's off
yeah.
the table. Any sort of knew the kind of spending we see in the Biden years was not gonna happen then, right?
Yeah, yeah. Black people knew before anyone else that the era of big government was
Right,
over,
right.
and they had been. That was the Black condition. They were prepared for that,
Yes,
and so
yes.
they had techniques. They had ways of raising money. They had ways of supporting Black organizations that are very old that they bring back and kind of intensify in the 1980s and 1990s. So when Jesse Jackson is kind of seemingly engaged in these neoliberal
Right,
practices of corporate partnerships and you know urban development programs and kind of these pro-growth of what we think of as like centrist initiatives, he's pulling from another tradition
mhm,
entirely that happens to dovetail quite neatly with what the neoliberal Democrats are doing, but it is coming from a different point of view, and it's kind of toward a different end as well.
I remember, and I didn't look this over. I can't remember, but he's a big defender of Clinton during the impeachment stuff, right?
Yes, yeah. Um, I wonder how much of that is because of his, own personal um, scandals that are happening
Around this time,
if
he's not.
around the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but he tended to defend Clinton in public. Even if they had their disagreements, he did kind of close ranks
Okay.
behind him. So we can kind of understand him as, supporting the Democratic candidate, but at the same time also knowing his personal history that there might have been some personal reason why he was doing that
I
as well.
skipped over. Do we think of your book hits Sister Soldier a little bit, but not
A
much?
little
So,
bit, yeah.
how do you view this 1990s moment where the Democratic Party is trying to move? This is all part of the centrism story. You think it's like this is
Mhm.
like it's both economic, but it's also like moving away from racial justice, essentially.
Yes, and I see, the Sister Soldier moment as, um, Clinton obviously making clear that he knows how to handle Jesse Jackson. That's
Right.
kind of how it was reported, that he wouldn't be beholden to Jesse Jackson's demands. Because there is this kind of narrative that the Democratic establishment was building that Jesse Jackson, had this kind of cult of personality that could sway Black people to do whatever, like he had them hypnotized or something like that, ignoring all the critiques and,
Yeah.
the complicated relationship that many Black Americans had with Jackson as a candidate and as a person.
Yeah.
But he wanted to show that he could handle Jesse Jackson, that he would not be beholden to him, that he was willing to publicly embarrass him. But I also think he wanted to demonstrate, or he kind of demonstrated, I don't know if this was his intent, that he was not willing to kind of hear the critiques of this new hip hop generation,
Interesting.
who had more kind of pointed, um, and perhaps like less polished critiques of white supremacy or
Mhm.
kind of the existing kind of political systems of oppression that were kind of framed in a more confrontational way
Sure.
than the kind of post than the civil rights generation who are still coming from that kind of church and protest politics um, sort of um, sort of approach. Um, and so when I think of the Sister Soldier moment, I think of kind of this new young generation of disaffected people who are further being demobilized and kind of disengaged from politics. But that sort of disrespectable sort of confrontational approach, I think does make a comeback in the mid 2010s with the movement for Black Lives, which is very much a youth led, I guess it would be the post hip hop generation, but
It's
that
definitely
same
post hip
sort
hop.
of,
Let me come back
yeah, that
and think of
same
that.
sort of energy. Um, and 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 we see again how the Clinton administration, not the Clinton administration, Bill and Hillary Clinton themselves kind of had to
Yeah.
negotiate that energy in new ways where they couldn't do a Sister Soldier moment anymore.
They don't couldn't
Um,
do that. They really want to. So the early 2000s, I think, I'm a 90s kid too, but I think by the 2000s, it is both when something bad happens in America for Black people, Sharpton or Jesse Jackson
mhm.
show up. Sharpton is maybe supplanting him, and if there's only one Black leader, Sharpton is maybe. So I want to talk about, though, Barack Obama coming along, because I think at the time, I probably interpreted Jesse Jackson as being envious of Barack Obama when he's criticizing him and so on. But that might have been correct, but there may
Yeah.
be a difference of political ideology here. Did Jesse Jackson recognize Barack Obama's neoliberal commitments and lack of leftist commitments maybe more than other people did?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. I mean, that famous hot mic quote, where I can't remember where Jesse Jackson was being interviewed, but he was caught on a hot mic. I don't know if I could say this on this live,
You can go
but
ahead and say it for yeah.
yeah, he said, I don't, something to the effect of, I don't like how Barack is talking down to Black people on these faith-based
Yes.
initiatives. It makes me want to cut his nuts
Anytime,
off.
like just to get some context, people, in '07, I remember I covered this. Obama, whenever he would go to a black crowd, would give a sort of speech about how there's racism, sure, but we need to sort of focus on making sure our kids go to school on time. We don't throw garbage in our neighborhoods. He would never talk about this in a white crowd, but in a black crowd, he'd give all
Yeah,
these sort of personal responsibility lectures that felt kind of annoying if you were a most people are not throwing garbage out of their houses at the time.
yeah,
And so Jesse Jackson responded to that, saying Obama should not lecture black people whenever he's in front of them.
yeah, kind of the cousin Pookie sort of
Cousin
thing.
Pookie, you need to vote.
The
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of stuff like this.
yeah, and so it's an interesting moment because Jesse Jackson was also would also kind of engage in that moralizing, disciplinary sort of language. Um,
But maybe now when you ran for president,
yeah, less so when he ran for president. But if we
yeah.
think about the kinds of speeches he was giving about the problem of, he's one of the people that popularizes the idea of black on black
Oh,
crime.
it's
He's
interesting.
one of the
Yeah.
first to use it. He, would always be decrying babies making babies and kind of, have this kind of moralizing approach to black social problems. He did not do that as a candidate. And I think that was the issue that he had with Obama
He thought
doing
Obama
that.
was doing it. He thought Obama was attacking black people to win white votes. So that's the subtext, I think.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Um, and that he would only do it to black people,
Yes.
that he would not do that in front of white audiences. And of course, Obama's engaged in this long tradition of castigating poor black people and their immoral behavior. But I think Jesse Jackson understood that that was not the time and space. That's not what a presidential candidate
I see.
should be doing. That's not what a black presidential
It should do.
candidate
Yes.
should be doing. We should be pouring into people and building them up. And I encourage everyone to go back and listen to his 84 Democratic National Convention or his 88 one. They're both
Yeah.
excellent. But that is not the vision that he was trying to create as a candidate. As a candidate, he was really trying to mobilize and inspire people and, help them understand that they mattered, that they could participate in the political process by, supporting Jesse Jackson and that they had a voice. He wasn't trying to shoot people down. He did that outside of his candidacy as the Reverend Jesse Jackson,
That's excellent.
but
Yeah.
as a candidate, he was trying to kind of continue the work of Dr. King and building this, beloved community that was built on, supporting people and kind of working to create the conditions for them to improve their lives rather than kind of um, yelling at them or scolding them for doing the best that they could in the conditions that they were living in, as Obama was doing.
Let me finish by talking about the 2010s. You made reference to it earlier. So, in some ways, this movement of young activists says we don't want to have a universal leader. We really don't want to have a male universal leader,
Hmm.
and we don't want and we want to have a diffuse movement. That is a critique of Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton
Yeah.
almost were that's and
Yes.
so yeah, I think that's what that was going right. That's what you agree, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, what is your assessment of what Black Lives connect Jesse Jackson and Black Lives Matter to me if you can anyway?
Yeah. I think that.
Are they in tension with each other? They are in this. I mean, the movement was not church based. It's not pastor based.
Hmm.
It's not male led. It's not single person led. But the
Hmm.
policy differences are not that. So talk about they're both critiquing racial
Yeah.
capitalism, which is a good phrase used early on. So talk about these movements and where Jesse Jackson and Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. I see Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, as sort of not a correction of Jesse Jackson's kind of movement, but an improvement of it.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there were kind of Black feminist organizers who were quite critical of the sort of politics of male charisma
Yeah.
that Jesse Jackson kind of relied upon. And I see the movement for Black lives as being in the tradition of that Black feminist and queer
Sure.
organizing as well. That is similarly identifying that they identify similar problems. I do think that they come to similar or different solutions. I think Jesse Jackson, I would not describe him as left.
Hmm.
Um, he still believed in the possibility of improving capitalism to work, you know,
Yeah.
less in a less discriminatory way. Whereas
Okay.
I think the movement for Black Lives is kind of more on the left, but they identify the same problems of economic violence. I think the movement for Black Lives has developed a fuller critique based and kind of expanded beyond the limitations of Jesse Jackson's kind of church based, Black liberal sort of
Okay.
reading of the problems.
Yeah.
But I do understand them, not necessarily in tension, but maybe in a productive tension. I'll say that. Um, but they definitely kind of emerged in response to the sort of Black male leader centered movement politics that had developed since, really, I mean, I was about to say since the death of King, but really including that vision of civil rights.
You said a couple things. Let me finish up by finish. So there's a lot of writing today, and I think we have a good piece in TNR talking about how the 84 and 88 campaigns of Jesse Jackson were this kind of economic populism that is coming back,
Mhm,
and maybe should have
mhm.
not been abandoned in the first place. But your overall picture is that Jesse Jackson was not a leftist social democrat every day of the week. He was his politics, his policy views were more complicated, and some of them were
Yeah.
more liberal Obama-ish than Bernie
Mhm.
Sanders. Is like a way to say that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love thinking about Jesse Jackson because he was really quite complicated, and um, he had a vision, uh, but it was limited in ways. His even his movement was limited in ways. But I do think that the fact that he had a clear moral vision of what is right, what is wrong, who are the enemies of the working class, um, that is far far more productive than a lot of the sort of politics of the kind of approach of Democrats in the present day. So even if he wasn't to the left and he kind of wanted to, reform capitalism and make it more democratic than kind of than other people that were to the left of him, he's still like on the spectrum that we
Sure.
currently have. He is still quite radical, and his 84 and 88 platforms would be kind of reviving some of those ideas would be a step in the right direction, I think, for today's Democrats.
And my final question is not about Jesse Jackson in some ways, but you're a historian. Where are we if we have a long Black freedom movement? Talk about 2014 to 2025. Do we have a movement for Black lives that ended, or it's continuing, or we're not having the mass protests. We had a period of
Yeah.
mass protests. We don't have them. People ask me all the time, what happened to Black Lives Matter? And it's tricky because I think a lot of those people like working on Zoran's campaign or
Hmm.
working for Working Families Party are doing stuff. But how do you see kind of Black activism today, thinking about the history that you study?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I see it. Yeah, it's hard for me to answer that question without kind of acknowledging the ways in which Black radical activism in particular is being policed and suppressed. I'm a scholar of Atlanta. I've been keeping up with the protests to stop the construction of the police training facility, or
What's referred to as Cop
City.
City. Okay, sorry to
Cop
make sure.
City,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So if we kind of take that as a
Okay,
case,
yeah.
they're throwing RICO charges at them and
Yes,
domestic terrorism charges,
yes.
and so I think it's important to kind of foreground the counterinsurgent measures that we've seen, um, not even before Trump came back into office, but really since 2020, 2021. And so I think that this is a moment, perhaps, where Black activists are needing to reimagine and reframe what the movement looks like in a mask off fascist state, to put it kind of crudely. I think the counterinsurgency has been intensified. Um,
Hmm.
and so that is shaping what the future will look like.
Um, Take a glass. I want to have ask one, and I'm still a little skeptical of this idea of leaderless movements, but is there are leader full? I've not ever been on board with that. But what's your position on? What's your thought about that?
Mm, sorry, my office is very dry.
Yes, take your time.
um, um,
Because Jesse Jackson is a product of the there must be 3 or 4 identified people that speak for
yeah.
Black folks era, and we're now in an era where we're trying to avoid that. And at times, I do want Cheryl and Eiffel to be appointed to be the leader of Black people, and we go to her, or somebody who is smart and thoughtful and respected. There are moments where I don't want to be a man, but I wish it was somebody. But there are maybe, but that's wrong. But I think that, but I've talked to the BLM folks who tell me that person might be assassinated. I just say that was let me not wish it upon Charlotte, but I mean, they tell me that's a dangerous thing. But maybe but I'm just sort of talking out loud here. Yeah, I'll stop now.
Yeah. Hmm. I hmm. I understand the kind of resistance to kind of the sort of leadership sort of sorry.
Take your time. We're fine.
My office gets like whenever yeah, it kind of bothers my allergies
Yeah,
after when I'm
take your time. We're
talking
not
for a
gonna
bit.
rush it. This is the last. Yeah, we're gonna finish here anyway. Yeah, take your time.
Sorry. Um I don't know. I'm a historian, so I'm always thinking about history in the past and kind
Yes,
of this sort of group centered leadership uh, paradigm that's kind of articulated by folks like Ella Baker.
yeah. Oh,
Um,
right, right.
and I think that there is an opportunity to maybe return to those foundational ideas about what leadership should look like. Because I think you're right that a completely leaderless movement, um, it makes it, difficult to organize kind of on a
Mm,
national or even kind of regional scale. At the same time, we know very well the limits of a charismatic leader
right.
led movement. So I do think that there is kind of a third way
Mm,
or
okay.
or a middle ground.
We're not for third
Uh,
ways except for this. Okay, right.
this one third way is okay. Um, that is grounded in those kind of Black organizing traditions,
Okay.
um, group centered leadership, participatory democracy, the way that Black labor unions were organizing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as well. I think now is a time to kind of return to the elders, talk to the elders while they're still here,
Yeah,
and to kind of resuscitate some of those practices because they say they face the same issues, right?
sure.
They were also, the student activists of SNCC were also very critical of having this Martin Luther King as the face
That's
of the
true. That's a great.
movement.
Yeah.
Called The Lord, as Stokely Carmichael would say. And so people have been thinking through these. These aren't new
These are
ideas.
not right.
So I think it's a good moment to kind of return to that moment because it's also a moment of repression as well. And so I think I think there's a lot that we can gain from engaging with those older kind of debates about who and how to lead.
Mm. Danielle, this is great. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Drink some water now.
Yeah.
Sorry, went over my time, and thank you.
No
It's, like I said, great
worries.
book, and I want
Thank
to encourage
you.
everybody to read. Danielle has a book out called Black Excellence. It talks about the post-civil rights struggles in Atlanta, but also throughout the country. Again,
Mhm.
Black Excellence. Danielle Wiggins is a professor at Georgetown. Thanks for joining me. Thanks everyone who came on. Bye bye.
Thank you.